Hey guys, Thomas the Jr. here, aka Mustached Time, and I'm here to review First Man. So, this movie chronicles Neil Armstrong's journey to the moon. Uh, so, we start off with him in space and doing some pretty basic uh, spot checks and getting in these little tests for this little shuttle plane that he is in. And he manages to get up to the space region. The shuttle that he is in starts to work its way back down, and he eventually lands. And we then chronicle through certain dates. The first being in 1961, where this team comes together uh, to essentially help him out. And what is happening is that he is having a family. His daughter is suffering through some condition, and the doctors essentially tell him that, or they kind of mention on the phone. I'm pretty sure he wasn't there to actually hear it, that she had a tumor and ended up passing away very young. Setting up in a very emotional state for this character to be in right off the bat. And I'm gonna say I didn't do. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to do the research, so I'm not sure which events in this movie are, like, akin to what really happened versus, dramatization for the sake of making the movie a little bit more extra. But to this movie's credit, I think that's where this movie shines. Is it's really hard to tell which parts are dramatized because it just sort of focuses on his family and his main objective of, getting to work on this adventure into going into space is sort of like just getting there is the sort of part that is the extra stuff, if you will. Uh, it is the actual story worth telling. So he goes in for an interview and eventually gets hired on to NASA in 1962. Uh, and of course, we see the earlier debacles of the U.S. going against Russia. Of course, this is, the race to space. This is a very big thing. This is, this was very evident. So, I think it was important to keep that aspect true to life, as it were. Uh, so, the wife has meets the neighbors, and they have these kids as well, and their little kids hang out together and stuff. Uh, Meanwhile, in 1964, the team gets this little test flight. It is the spinning device, uh, very constantly used to get astronauts prepared to go up into space. Um, So Neil sets himself up first, and eventually, when it is increased in speed, he does eventually pass out. And he does eventually go again after it is done, and then vomits afterwards. So, to prepare even further, he has to go in through the long haul of learning about physics and stuff of that nature. Uh, and when he comes of home eventually, he does decide to just take some relaxing time, dance with his wife, and with some slow music. Uh, and again, this movie is very grounded. We see the families just eat together and talk together and have fun. Uh, And I think that really sets up the ending for this movie fairly well. Uh, so they check the news to see that Russia was starting to get ahead in what they were doing, which does piss off some of the members within the NASA team off pretty highly. But later on that same year, in 1965, uh, Neil gets told by one of the team members that he will potentially be one of the candidates to be one of the first to dock out on the moon, and he's quite surprised to even hear this. He's not even sure that it will be possible to get there. And again, we cut to some more just the family hanging out on the pool, having some fun. Uh, So we get some more shenanigans from the families and stuff. Um, so there's all that stuff going on. I'm gonna skip over some of the notes because it is just sort of people talking to each other about some pretty simple stuff, I'll say. There is a brief moment though that Neil does see his daughter, the envisionment of that, and of course you know, I'm gonna say for the sake of argument that is a bit of dramatization. There is seeing the daughter after the fact. Um, so he goes off on his own and he's trying to just look up at the stars and take some time to himself. And then it cuts to him in a spacesuit, ready for another test ride. He turns some knobs and does some of that stuff, gets the countdown. The shuttle comes down and they manage to once again reach the mark of space. So, it cuts to one of his sons. I believe it might have been the younger son. They eventually had another kid at some point. I don't know at what point they mentioned that, but they did show the wife being pregnant again at some point. Again, I'm just not entirely sure where in the timeline that fit in, but regardless, he did grow up and and he's starting to learn to read. Uh, and they check in with Houston afterwards, like when they're back there. Meanwhile, the wife gets this little device where she's able to essentially listen in on what's essentially going on with Neil and the team. And on this little particular mission, Neil is looking for this other shuttle that had earlier in the movie. I forgot where this again happened, but I believe the shuttle was called the Agena, and the Agena had gotten stuck up there in space somewhere, and so they essentially attached to it. They docked to it, and they eventually hurled it in a direction. I assumed that they were trying to hurl it back to Earth. I'm not sure if that ever got there, but essentially what happened is from them hurling in that sort of way, it got their own shuttle to spin out of control. And it took Neil Armstrong uh, bursting a lot of their source of power, I'll say, to steer them and calm them down so they can be on a singular, not moving, essentially. Uh, so, Houston, being as concerned as it was, immediately cut off as this situation was happening to pretty much make sure that if anything bad happened, that no one would hear it. But the wife is so upset by this that she makes her way over and tells them to turn it back on. Regardless, it does seem like things sort of work themselves out, and then it cuts to the next year in 1966, where Neil is asked by the press several questions. And we again get some more time with the son just learning piano. All these smaller details of like the life that is just happening. And there's a newspaper article about the wild ride in space, which is a remark on what happened with the Agena. The news outlet took it as like this was a failure, apparently. But eventually that all comes full circle in a weird way. And while that's going on, the wife decides to talk to her neighbor about why she even married Neil Armstrong in the first place. She was talking about how she wanted a normal man, and then all of this sort of just came about. And he talks with his other neighbor, Joe, who eventually actually ends up just joining the team. Uh, And again, Neil's mission, by NASA's standards, was considered a success. So he spends some time with his kids afterwards. He's just hanging out with them. Again, just messing around, just taking some time to, actually be a parent. Anyways, they're talking about their kids, Neil and Joe, there. And then it cuts to 1967, where the team gets ready for this another like shuttle test, and there's three of them. Joe is one of them, and there's two others. I'm not sure who they were. Uh, Meanwhile, Neil was at this sort of cordial with higher ups and talking about what was the cost of going to space, and he kind of got upset by that because the cost ended up being, it ended up not, at least for him, not being about the money, but rather the people who he eventually would come to lose along the way. Speaking of that, it cuts back to the team that we see there, and they're kind of complaining about the lack of communication that is coming through, and then a fire sparks out and the cockpit bursts into flames, and the three, including Joe, are caught in that flame and killed in the process. Again, I'm not sure if that was dramatization or if that's something that actually happened. Again, I can't really say for sure. So Neil learns about this eventually, and that it does get him upset. But we cut then to 1968, and Neil wants to go through another shuttle test. This shuttle is like more akin to something that works outside. And the craft itself eventually ends up falling and bursting into flames, and Neil barely ejects himself from that seat and gets out of that unscathed, or well, not unscathed, but he does get slightly marked in the face. And he says when he gets back down there is that he was doing this in order to make sure that all the failures were to happen on Earth so that they would not fail when, in order of preparation of getting it to the moon. And again, that issue of cost once again does come up, and then Neil does mention like again that cost of just losing the additional three members of that team. So the wife talks to the neighbor who had been married to Joe and is now a widow, so she's trying to console her. And Neil gets back home, sort of dejected a bit still. So the news, it cuts to like this news out, sort of like actually showing some real news like stuff mixed in with some newer stuff that they recorded of people getting upset on the actual money being spent, and it's like we're sending people to the moon when there's people suffering here, and to the credit, there's a lot of validation to that argument, or there could have been at the time. You know, in our history, I don't think we have actually gone or attempted to go to the moon in a really long time, as far as I am aware. Um, Again, I don't even know what the cost of going inside a rocket would be these days, or even back then. So, again, funding being an issue of like real life, it's pretty big. So, you know, they do manage to get a rocket in. I'm not. It was kind of like it almost implied there was a bit of shadiness to that, but I don't know. Anyway, in 1969, there's another press meeting where Neil talks about, the worry or the success of, like, the people are asking, like, what his success will feel like or if he'll even make it. And he's kind of gotten to this point in stance where he's trying to be very subtle about what he's saying up there. And then when he gets back home, he doesn't want to even talk to his kids because he had lost the three members and he was very afraid of the legitimate potential of getting lost to this mission and then having his kids never see him again. But he does eventually, after his wife yelling at him, sit down with his two children and pretty much explain what the potential of everything will be. And one of the kids asks what he will say when he gets up there instead of, like, will you even get up there? They do ask it, but again, they do present both sides, which again I think is pretty interesting for the kids to have that moment. So we finally cut to Neil, Buzz, and I forgot who the other team member was. Sorry, but I don't know if they mentioned his name or not in the movie, but I'm pretty sure there might have been someone else actually really with them. Buzz, of course, that's where, if you don't know, that's where Buzz Lightyear that name comes from. And then, of course, Neil Armstrong himself. So anyways, they start to head off to the rocket, and the rocket blasts off into space, and then they have some time to chill around, and apparently there's like this time frame where they need to be just like relaxing and making sure everything's fine, and they're checking in with Houston. So, they're spending time, and then they start to move a little bit closer, and they descend their little, the smaller part of the space shuttle. They start to slowly but surely run out of fuel as they make their landing. And it switches to a camera where we're, seeing Neil come down, and it shows a side by side of him, and then on the news of, like, him going down and then him pausing there before he gets down to plant his feet, and then eventually the jump down. And of course, he eventually makes his way down after making sure everything's fine with the actual shuttle itself. He takes his first steps on the moon and says the iconic line of one short step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And it was definitely at that moment where I was like, that was rather emotional. Like, after everything we had seen, it is a 2-hour movie, but man, was that worth it? Like, it makes that line have so much more impact when you just see this movie, and it definitely got a little emotional there. It was really touching. So he eventually makes his way back, and it shows like his family, celebrating, and everyone's celebrating, and the news talking about it. And then he just relaxes with his wife, and later on in that year, and that was First Man. And boy oh boy, was this an awesome movie. I really, really like this movie. It is a long haul, sure, but the journey to get there was so well done. It was so well crafted. Just the family aspect, just really building up that. It's a weird tension almost because the mission again itself there's so many variables. I'm sure, you know, some which I don't even think could have even been touched upon in the movie, and I don't think it would have ever had the same amount of gravitas regardless. Having the three men die in that one mission, again, I'm not really sure if that's a thing that happened or not. There might have been people who've gotten hurt or have gotten sick on the previous, on one of the earlier test when it's just that spinning cube thing. Just all of these rigorous things to get ready for space. And we've come such a long way. We just have shuttles in space now. It's crazy. To see how far we've come and to finally celebrate this. I feel like there hasn't actually ever been a movie about getting to the moon, about Neil Armstrong getting to the moon. I could be misremembering. I don't know. If anyone knows of any other version of this story, let me know in the comments, because I honest to God think that this might be the first one. I'm not 100% sure on that. But even if it's not, I still enjoy this story. I still love this movie. I think it is a phenomenal movie. I definitely would give this either an 8 or even a 9 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed First Man. Definitely a top contender for movie of this year. Definitely. If you have not seen it, definitely check it out. I know it's a little bit of a long haul, but I do think it's definitely worth it. And that's my review of First Man. And if you enjoyed this review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also make sure to check out that link in the description or head over to my Patreon page, and any donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, everyone, bye-bye.